It's very much an honor for me to moderate what is a very impressive panel of speakers. So for this panel, we are going to have first a keynote presentation, followed by 3 other presenters, and hopefully have a very engaged conversation, not only amongst the presenters, but as well with members of the audience. I know it's a converged group of people here from both broadcasting, telecommunications sectors, but those of you that think this is a lean-back experience, please don't come with that attitude. It's early in the morning, but I want you to participate in the exchange later on and note your questions and participate in the dialogue. I won't give full bios of the panelists because they're available on the IIC website, but I will briefly introduce in the order in which they will make their presentations our excellent speakers. First of all, Mauricio Ramos, who's the CEO of Millicom International Cellular. Then we'll hear from Kemal Huseinović, who's the Chief of the Department of Infrastructure, Enabling Environment, and E-Applications at the ITU, more specifically the Telecommunication Development Bureau. Then we will hear from Ross Lejeunesse, who's the Global Head of International Relations at Google. And finally, from Carlos Lopez Blanco, who's Global Head of Public and Regulatory Affairs at Telefónica. So today we'll be, in this panel, discussing connecting the unconnected in the emerging and mature markets, innovative business technology and financing models to connect the next 4 billion people. So exciting and daunting all at the same time. So why don't we hear first from Mauricio? Do you want to speak from here, or would you rather speak from...
I'll do it over there.
Okay, good. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Delighted to join you. Connecting the unconnected. We all think of connectivity as the next wave of it. Machine to machine, virtual reality, smart sitting, parking meters, applications that sit on our mobile devices, and seamless fixed mobile connectivity. But connectivity for the unconnected is very, very different. And connectivity for the unconnected relies on getting a satellite dish up a mountain on a donkey. And a few other less technical solutions to build those networks. And a few other technical solutions to distribute those cell phones. And a few other less technical solutions to educate those consumers about what being connected means. Let me tell you a little bit about where we come from and how we view connecting the unconnected. Millicom, the company that I am the CEO of, operates under the brand name Tigo in most of the markets in which we operate. We operate in 14 markets around the globe, all of them emerging markets, largely in Latin America, but also in Africa. We operate in Colombia, Paraguay, Bolivia, and in most of Central America. And we operate in Tanzania, Ghana, the DRC, Rwanda, and other countries in Africa. So we are squarely in the business of connecting the unconnected. We are a small to medium-sized company with about $6.5 billion of revenue worldwide, around 60 million mobile subscribers, and perhaps a differentiating factor is that we believe squarely in fixed mobile convergence. And as a result of that, we are aiming to connect the unconnected, not only with mobile, but also with fiber, hybrid coaxial fiber or cable, And we have now covered about 7 million homes in that footprint with HFC. So this is who the unconnected are worldwide. And this is a bit of math up there, but I want to point to 4 key messages that that math squarely shows. And the chairman of the SEC was addressing similar numbers to those here. There are 4 key things that should jump at you from these charts. First is that indeed, if you go to the right-hand side of those charts, there are indeed 4 billion unconnected individuals in the world. That's about 57% of the population in the world. So there's actually more unconnected than there are unconnected. The most interesting fact, I think, is that 95% that shows immediately to the left, which effectively means that despite the unconnected problem in the US, at a worldwide level, 95% of the unconnected actually sit in emerging markets, not in mature markets. Effectively, if you move a little bit to the left, you will see that 18%, which means that in mature markets, only 18% are unconnected. But if you move further to the left, the 4th key message here is that indeed, in emerging markets, 65% of the population is unconnected. That's 2 out of 3 that are unconnected, making this squarely an emerging market problem. I'm a CEO, so I love numbers. So the next question is, well, that's a problem. How fast? This is literally the way we put this presentation together with my team. You know, what's the problem? How fast is it getting fixed? And this is the answer the team came up with, making use of publicly available information, and a lot of it has come out over the last 2 to 3 weeks. So how quickly is the problem being solved? The first thing that jumps at you from this chart, dark blue is mature, light blue is emerging, is that the problem, if you want to call it that way, the challenge probably is a more positive tone, has been quickly addressed in emerging markets, but far less so than in mature markets. As a matter of fact, the key thing that jumps at you out here is that the rate of connectivity in mature markets happened really, really quickly. Not so in emerging markets. Whereas connectivity in emerging markets was increasing at levels of 24%, it is now only increasing at levels of 12%. Therefore, the rate of connectivity is actually decreasing. The rate of speed at which the problem is being addressed is actually slowing. And if you do a little bit of math on the numbers that we've been throwing around, and you add up the fact that you have 4 billion unconnected, and that they're being connected only at a rate of 12%, and assume that that rate actually does not decrease, then you will quickly realize that the unconnected will take decades to be connected. Just do the math. What does it mean then for these consumers to not be unconnected? We're all sitting here with our Wi-Fi connections, and we probably got here with an Uber application. These are actually real quotes from our real customers across the globe, and they come from our consumer understanding surveys. So for them, it's about financial inclusion. Actually, that comes up #1 just about all the time. It's about education. It's about the ability to do business, and that means being able to sell fresh produce, not hail a taxi. Entertainment, for sure. Connectivity is a lot about entertainment, and that should not be underscored or undermined. And it is about gender and economic inclusion. When we talk about mobile in these markets, it seems as though a key element of inclusion of what mobile can provide to these societies is actually financial services. Mobile financial services. Perhaps the way to just throw what this means is to speak of the way mobile financial services were first brought into most of our countries. They were initially brought to solve a very, very acute problem. An individual wanting to send money from city A to city B would have to send cash and would typically give that cash to a bus driver to then deliver it across the country to another individual. Just a basic non-wire transfer. That's how mobile financial systems first developed. It so happens that there were mobile subscribers on both ends, that there were mobile collection points to prepaid cards or buy prepaid cards at that point in time on both point A and point B. So it was safer, simply safer, to hand the money over to a retail agent, a mobile retail agent on point A, send a message, and that have money be withdrawn at point B by another mobile service agent, therefore increasing security. That's the start of mobile financial services, the basic level. And what it's actually doing is simply providing financial inclusions for those that were connected but remained unconnected to the financial systems. A couple of numbers from the countries we operate probably highlight how relevant this is. In Tanzania, for example, about 19% of the population has a bank account. 33% of the population uses mobile financial services. In Paraguay, where our system counts 1.3 million mobile financial service users, that number is actually higher in absolute numbers than the number of bank accounts in the country. Understanding the problem from the point of the consumer is the only way for a company to start to address it. So the key to this element, and I think that the chairman addressed it this way as well, is to be very consumer-centric in the way you try to address the supply problems and the demand problems. And interestingly, a lot of the supply problems seem to be on the way of being properly addressed. The chairman was talking about 95% of the world population actually being covered by a mobile network. We're showing 80%, perhaps the sources are a little different, but the direction is the same. So accessibility seems to be being widely addressed. So is the cost of ownership, as mobile devices have become increasingly cheaper and cheaper. Be mindful, however, that has changed over the last 3 months. And I will address this in a minute because it is not a small point. And of course, then from the supply side, operators need to be very, very careful in not complicating our product offer. Shying away, moving away from complex offers. And I'll address that in a minute. There is a lot that needs to be done at the governance level, but there is a lot that needs to be done on the demand side. And I think this is where most of the work, cohesively, collectively, holistically, but this is where most of the work in emerging markets still needs to be done. And I'll address in a minute what we need to do in order to increase the value perception of connectivity, the availability of actual content that is relevant to consumers, the affordability, and the cultural issues. So let me get to those. These are the 3 elements of the supply side of the equation. And there it is, 80% connected population, covered population with 3G, and about 35% with 4G. 80% covered, but only about 40%, if you do the math again, actually take the service. That's very telling. tells you that the supply side of the equation is being addressed. The demand side of the equation is a lot more work on. And look at the cost of ownership, significantly decreasing. We've actually taken our own information here, the average entry-level smartphone in our markets, and the lowest entry level. And you can easily see that a 3G phone is now in the $40 range. FX put aside the problem of the last 3 months or so. So that is being quickly addressed. And the complexity of the problems is actually being addressed because, luckily, these are extensively prepaid markets. So do not think of postpaid accounts like in the Western economies, in the mature economies. Think of these as daily consumption prepaid models in which the price per bit, the size of the product offer is key. And I'll address that in a minute. Look at the demand side, however, and this is where things get really, really interesting. 80% covered, 40% actually connected. Value perception is number one. This is consumer-centric information. The number one issue from the demand side is that consumers actually, despite of everything I have actually said so far, do not value the internet. And what they mean by that is the value proposition. It's not that it's not attractive. It's not that they would not like to be connected. They just don't see enough value on the internet. What's in it for me? That's actually number one in consumers. Number two is actually literacy. And that's centrally the concept of there isn't enough content out there in the internet for me in my local language. And see how actually accessibility is a distant third. The purpose of this slide is simply to suggest that there is a lot at work here and that there's a lot that needs to be done from many, many different stakeholders. Let's look a little bit about the things that we have found at Tigo that actually work in solving both supply and demand. On the supply side, the thing that actually does work is first building the networks. This is a business in which the money gets poured into the ground first. There's no modularity to this business. The money in hard currency gets put into the ground first. So bringing that 4G connectivity, building that fiber, is something that happens on the back of the expected increased wave of connectivity. Over the last 2 years, in the markets that I've referred, we've launched DTH in 5 of them. We've increased 4G coverage by about almost 400%. And as I said earlier, we built fiber in these emerging countries. And we've done a lot in terms of sharing the networks to reduce the cost of the build-out. In key countries like Colombia, we've actually built a 4G network in partnership with Telefónica, with the blessing of the Colombian government, a key element to reduce that cost. And that's something that makes a lot of sense to see a lot of. The cost of ownership is about driving the price down. 60 to 70% of the 3G handsets that we sell in our markets are at that entry-level price. That's how important that is. But it is equally important to provide financing for those handsets. The subsidy model is very important in terms of increasing connectivity. We've gone actually a step further in a country like Paraguay, and we're actually in Paraguay financing the sale of the handset by a financial institution, a transaction that actually gets done over mobile financial services, in situ, right at the moment in which the transaction takes place. I have said that demand is equally important. Question is, how do you educate a population about the use of the internet? And as it turns out, the best mechanism to educate the population about the use of the internet is to actually educate first your sales force. So over the past couple of years, we've actually gone through educating our entire sales force. 8,000 door-to-door or person-to-person distribution salespeople have been educated in what the internet is on a mobile phone, what apps can be put on a mobile phone, so that they can go and present a selling proposition that actually explains the advantages of that mobile. And remember, in these countries, mobile gets still sold through a very, very large distribution network. The typical distribution network in any of these markets is somewhere between 30 to 60,000, that is the number, points of sales. So it's not a few outlets on a mall, it's actually little individuals with a stand selling. Those are the catalysts of explaining what the internet is and providing a solution to the education problem. The key thing to solve for, since the key element that most subscribers want in their mobile phone is financial inclusion, is to use mobile financial services to increase the perception of value of the internet for those that are unconnected. 15 to 20% of the top-ups in airtime in our countries are now done through mobile financial services. 4.5%, just to use an example, of the Paraguayan GDP goes through mobile financial services. So by promoting mobile financial services, we are providing increased value perception for what connectivity means. And making the internet a lot more local. We've made significant amount of progress in providing local content so that consumers see a more valuable proposition in our product. And of course, the most widespread content is sports in Africa and in Latin America. And the availability of local content on DTH, cable, and mobile that is local increases the value perception of the connected world. So what have we learned in terms of supply, demand, and how we can better work with governments in our experience? 5 areas that we think are key takeaways of what that relationship should be to better connect the yet unconnected. The first one is indeed to embrace competition. No doubt about that. The more competition there is, and of course there are some trade-offs that I will address in a minute, the more unconnected we will turn into connected. The chairman's remarks on this particular point around OTT and competition were very, very meaningful. There is an additional challenge in markets outside the US, which is that of where revenue gets booked. Network operators are still local players, OTT players are international players. And that is an additional element of complexity that, luckily, we need to work as an ecosystem to solve for. It's not a US problem, largely, it's an international problem. Then, of course, spectrum, which I'll talk a little bit about, infrastructure sharing, I mentioned that, and universal access. So let me spend 2 minutes on spectrum, and again, address it from the point of view of numbers, which I love. And this will only highlight what the chairman of the SEC was already bringing to the table. We all need spectrum. Spectrum is necessary for what we do. It's the lifeline, it's the blood, it's the engine fuel. But here are actually some projections of the megahertz demanded by the increasing level hunger for connectivity. 1400 megahertz. It implies for the developed or more mature world a 3-fold increase from the amount of spectrum available today. The second key message, however, is that the amount of spectrum available today in emerging economies is half of the amount of spectrum available in more mature economies. Therefore, if consumers that today are unconnected are not only to become connected, but have the same level of spectrum available to them, and therefore the possibility of a similar experience as those that are connected in mature markets today, then the challenge is actually to increase that availability by 6-fold. I think the math speaks for itself. And here is, you would have expected a speaker not to put this chart out because you can't read it. And I actually turned it down and then realized that the fact that you can't read it is actually the point. It means, effectively, if you can read through the decodification there, that a spectrum is available to the tune of the needs that I just showed, but tons and tons and tons of work needs to be done to refarm it, reallocate it, capture it, and then release it or re-release it. It also highlights implicitly a second point, which is that increasingly connecting the unconnected will also need to rely on the use of fixed networks. I'm a cable guy, and only recently turned a mobile guy. And here's the big difference. Mobile has to use public spectrum. Fixed networks create their own spectrum by laying that pipe. So the challenge really lies on using both mobile and fixed networks. And that concept alone should be clear enough to summarize the need for fixed mobile convergence from the operator's point of view and from the regulatory point of view. It's the only way to create that spectrum because it's not going through the airs, it's going through the pipes. But spectrum allows for ubiquitous connectivity. And the only way to simplify the conundrum that we as an industry have with regards to spectrum is not that it's not available, is not that it won't be needed in increasing buckets of demand. It is indeed that we must come to terms with what the policy goals are for that spectrum. And governments around the world, and we operate in 14 countries, have basically 2 or 3 possible policy goals. First one is to increase competition by allocating spectrum to possibly new entrants. And that is a valuable goal. But of course, there is a point of diminishing returns at which new entrants do not add new competition, but rather diminish the return and the ability to invest of those that are already in the marketplace. So that policy goal needs to be weighed very, very carefully against a second policy goal, which is common in starved cash economies, which is to use spectrum as a way to shore up the revenue of the country. Again, that's a very valuable policy goal, but it must be weighed against connecting the unconnected, which is a third and very valuable policy goal. This is a balancing act between competition, tax revenue, and creating more and more connectivity. There's 1,000 very, very interesting agendas out there. There are governments that are doing fantastic things, there are governments that are balancing things, and there are governments that are waking up to certain new challenges. The initiatives that we have found the strongest are those that promote demand by helping create the local need. E-government initiatives are fantastic because they provide low-income consumers with a very valuable reason to use the internet. Digital agendas, such as the one that the government in Colombia put in place a few years ago, are fantastic. And I think a new element has come into the equation for governments to consider. I said earlier that this is a business in which the capital investment goes up front, you build a network, and you aim to get the consumers. But it's also a business in which 70, 80%, depends on the company, of the capital investment is paid for in hard currency. Let's not lose sight of that. It is essential to this conversation. Over the last 3 months, most of these emerging markets have devalued their currencies significantly. Colombia has had a 70% devaluation in the last 12 months, give or take, I could be off. Tanzania, 30%, Paraguay, 20%. These are the markets I know. Revenue, however, is in local currency. That element creates an economic challenge for connecting the unconnected, because it has turned upside down the economic value for the network operator. It simply has become much more difficult to earn a return on an investment that is largely put in place upfront and in hard currency when you're earning in not hard currencies in these markets. It is meaningful. And certain countries have actually caught up to this problem and are beginning to do something that is pretty smart, which is eliminating value-added taxes on smartphones as a way to reduce the burden on the consumer to become connected. That is the single hardest burden for a consumer, is to pay for that handset, even at $40 or at $100, not at $800 as in other devices in the smart world. So anything that allows a subsidy model, an elimination of taxes on the handset, or financing of that handset will help solve this problem of FX. And let me finish up by restating perhaps a little bit the problem that is ahead of us, even as the emerging economies have devalued their currencies. We're looking at, if you go from left to right there, at about 1 billion new users over the next few years. So that means the individuals using those networks are going up by about 1 billion. The usage per consumer is increasing every year. About 2 gigabytes per month on a mobile network today, about 45 in the developing world today, and that is increasing twofold every year. Depends on the country, but these are actually the numbers. 30 to 1 mobile to cable, but increasing by 100% every year. Why? Because of video, but increasingly so because of the new connected devices that are going to come online. Vending machines, driverless cars, virtual reality, P2P. Those are going to generate an increasingly explosive demand on those networks. More people, more usage per consumer, and more machines connected to that network. That actually also means not only that there will be more capacity demands, but that the latency of those networks will need to improve significantly, and that they will need to be far more symmetrical than they have been so far. That's a pretty mighty challenge in terms of connecting the unconnected. And this is why fixed mobile convergence is so important. That's a key message. Because mobile networks rely on public spectrum, it's less efficient to provide a bit over mobile than it is over cable, and consumers could not care less. So fixed mobile convergence and enabling that is significant. And that's why we at Tigo have believed that everywhere where we're trying to connect the unconnected and we have a mobile network, there must be a fixed network underneath us. Because ultimately, if we want to believe in what the internet should be for those that are unconnected, I'd like to perhaps take you back to an image that I had as a child. I was born in Colombia, and I used to come to the US, and I would see the highways here in the US. 6 lanes, connected with rings, and of course, the roads that we had at home were not that. That's the equivalent of the internet that we don't want to recreate in the emerging economies, that have that divide, that digital divide that used to exist, not so much anymore, on physical infrastructure, on our digital infrastructure, so that the challenge becomes trying to make our internet look a little bit closer to the images on the bottom right there. Thank you.
Who is going to set up the... Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, let me thank to IIC for inviting me on this panel and giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of the International Telecommunication Union. The title of the presentation is The Regulator's Role in Meeting Socio-Economic Goals and Unconnected. Let me start with what we have today, comparing to that what we had 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, only 1% of people had access to the mobile services. So penetration was only 1%. Only 11% of people had access to the fixed telephone networks, so penetration was 11%. What we have today, we have nearly 7 billion people with mobile services available. We have almost 720 million fixed broadband subscriptions globally by the end of 2014. There is a forecast that the global fixed broadband subscriptions will reach 920.2 million by 2019, driven by consumers' demand for high-speed internet access. Fixed broadband showed limited growth between 2013 and 2014. Mobile broadband subscriptions have continued to increase rapidly. Overall, fixed global penetration has reached 9.8%, while broadband mobile reached 32% by the end of 2014. Now we can see what we have from in the last 55 years in ICT world. Internet, World Wide Web, mobile, broadband, smartphones, tablets, social media, drones, and we are expecting connected cars, billions of sensors connected on the internet, mass wearables, cognitive computing, etc., etc. But still, 4.3 billion people are not online. They are not connected. Still, 450 million people are not covered by the signal of mobile networks. And they don't have access to the digital world. They don't have a chance to get a highly paid job related to the ICT capabilities. And let me emphasize that still many millions of ICT users lack the digital literacy skills. And they can't get higher paid digital jobs. broadband divide remains large. Developed countries achieved 82% mobile broadband penetration. Developing countries only 21%. For fixed broadband is similar, 27.5% in developed countries and 6% in developing countries. So, what we can do to reduce this gap? What regulators can do? What policymakers can do? What we can do together on the global scene? It's obvious that affordable and effective broadband connectivity is an enabler of economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. It is clear that broadband deserves status of the national policy, national priority. A research conducted for the Broadband Commission in 2013 suggested that introduction of broadband plan is associated with 2.5% higher fixed broadband penetration and 7.4% higher mobile broadband penetration on average. So broadband should be national priority for policymakers, for regulators, for the whole society. And it requires for national commitment. So here we can see on this slide how regulators and the regulatory frameworks and regulatory policies could shape the ICT sector. Regulators definitely have a crucial role to play in shaping ICT field. They have to create an enabling environment to bridge this digital divide, to enhance innovation, boost the investment, to strengthen infrastructure development in general. Although there is no single bullet, no silver bullet, no single recipe, it is obvious that creating an enabling environment and regulatory framework and by adopting the policy and the regulations directed to meet the changes in ICT field generally have better results. Access to technology is more available, is better if you have a good regulatory policy. And this good regulatory policy and access to the technology and ICT must also be combined with relevant skills, opportunities, and capacities. The divide is most visible in its gender dimension. Gender digital divide is really difficult to overcome, so countries need to adopt effective policies and strategies to make broadband available, affordable, and accessible. It is vital to extend access to digital education services, new capabilities, culture, entertainment, healthcare, financial and commercial services, along with training and education. Empowering people via broadband need much more than just infrastructure. It requires the development of new services, new applications, new content, based on the local contents. So, it is good to mention definitely that there is different stages in the development of regulation. Let me mention that first stage of regulation was regulation of monopoly. Regulation was a part of the function of the government structure, mostly located in the ministries, and it was the purpose was to protect the public enterprises, to protect the monopoly. Second stage was a stage when we got to independent regulatory bodies. They had to introduce competition. They had the chance to open the scene for the new players. And the third stage is boosting the investment and adopting more flexible policies and regulatory frameworks to embrace the potential of the digital economy. And definitely today, fourth generation is integrated generation, and we could say that the disruptive nature of the transition to digital world is putting ICT regulators and policymakers under pressure to continuously review and adopt and anticipate changes to ensure that their national ICT regulatory frameworks remain relevant, while also ensuring the social development goals continue to be met. So adopting the flexible regulatory frameworks is a conditio sine qua non in order to get the full benefit and to get to use the full potential of the ICT capabilities. You have to create a modern, flexible regulatory framework which will allow fast adoption of new technologies and appearance of new players that will be able to provide new services with the good choices of prices and qualities. It is also extremely important that regulators have adequate enforcement powers to respond to the challenges of this dynamic digital environment. So we could also say that fourth generation of regulation is regulation that should incorporate in its portfolio of activities cooperation with the other regulators. It means different kind of so-called content regulators, like financial regulators. In order to get better results in the field of financial inclusion on the global level, you need to create and build good cooperation and collaboration with the financial regulators in order to increase the level of the financial inclusion on the globe. So here we can see regarding the ITU measurement system using our ICT regulatory tracker tool, we have made this assessment and got this diagram that shows that there is countries that are just starting to apply 4G integrated regulation, and that regulation didn't give immediate results, but it opened the door to the new capabilities, possibilities, and new chances for the countries to improve their situation in the ICT field, and that will allow leveraging of the ICT sector in order to achieve economic growth and social development across the whole economy. So I hope that I kept within the time limit. So that was my short presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm going to speak from here. I'm going to stay next to my friend from the ITU and next to Chairman Blais. And I don't have a presentation, so I'm just going to speak from some notes. I basically want to thank you for having me here, and I want to tell you a little bit about Google's approach and projects to this issue of increasing access. And I agree very much with Mauricio that this is, of course, a demand-side problem as well as a supply-side problem. I'm going to focus on some of the projects we're doing on the supply side, but from the very beginning of the company, Google has been focused also on the demand side, recognizing the need to serve users wherever they might be in the world. Today, we have our products are offered in 180 different languages. We also, with Google Translate, enable our users to find information and use products in an additional 90 languages beyond that. And those numbers are constantly growing because our incentives, of course, are aligned with the goals of increased access. We want everyone to be accessing the internet, and that's completely in line with our business priorities as well, right? More people online, more people using the internet, good for business, right? So it makes sense that we're constantly striving to get more and more people online. So on the supply side, you know, that's a relatively new area for us to be focused on, to be honest. We've started doing it in the past couple years, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the pretty exciting things that we have going on in that space, to be honest. And our approach to the supply side is really focused on 3 distinct areas. The first is we have to address the issues of electricity and power. You can have the greatest telco infrastructure in the world, but if you don't have users who can power up their device, if you don't have power to, you know, run that system, there's really no point in it. So you can't just address the telco infrastructure without also addressing the issue of electricity and power. And in parts of the world where access is a particularly difficult issue to solve, not surprisingly, those are also parts of the world where the power and energy issue is also pretty difficult. So I'm going to say a little bit about that. But first of all, the second issue is reducing the cost of providing internet through new technologies and projects that we've got going. And the third is sort of really the backbone infrastructure stuff. And Mauricio was also very smart to point out that, you know, the cost of a device is often the biggest impediment as well. So when you look at our Nexus products, you know, our handsets, we've really focused on trying to build affordable devices. And of course, the Android operating software is free and open source. And we think those are really 2 things that are helping make internet more accessible to more users around the world. So let's just quickly, I'm going to run through the 3 and just give you a little sense of some of the projects. And look, none of this, as Mauricio and as others have said, is a silver bullet. This isn't a cure-all. But I just want to paint a picture of what one company is trying to do to, you know, contribute to addressing the problem. On the energy side of things, we're basically trying to put our money where our mouth is. We're investing in projects all around the world to provide, you know, carbon-free energy. One such project is the Jasper Solar Project in South Africa. We just completed our investment there, which will be online in a few years. 96 megawatts of power. And much of our investments in energy projects are focused in Africa because that's where the problems are. In countries like that, in areas of the world like that, you know, as Mauricio's presentation outlined, you know, the low-hanging fruit has been grabbed. What we're dealing with now are increasingly higher-hanging fruit, more difficult areas to serve, but we're getting there. We also have this really cool project. It's called Project Makani. I now think I should have brought some slides just to show you pictures of what these things are because they look really cool. Makani is basically, they're kites. They go up, they're a couple 100 meters up, and they use the power of the wind stream. They go around in this big circle, and they're generating electricity. Very similar to wind turbines, but the difference with Makani is they eliminate 90% of the materials needed for a wind turbine, and that reduces the cost by 50%. We all know that one of the big barriers for renewables is the cost. And the reason why there aren't more investors in that space is the cost. So as we make progress in some of these projects, you start to prove the value proposition, more investors come in. So we're actually trying to lead by example, and we're not afraid of trying out projects where we're going to lose some money because we're trying to prove that it can be done and pave the way for others to follow us. The second main area is, you know, reducing the cost of delivering internet. I think many of you have heard of Project Loon. We had a lot of people laughing at us when we first announced this project. People aren't laughing so much now. Loon is basically launching, they're like weather balloons actually. They're about twice as high as a commercial airliner. And what they're doing is they're beaming broadband down to areas which otherwise can't be served. Got a huge mountain, what are you going to do? Try and lay fiber across it, through it, over it. You saw some of Mauricio's pictures. Very, very good pictures because they give you an accurate sense of some of the issues that we're trying to solve. Project Loon is working. They're staying up, for example, twice as long as we thought they would. It's actually going better than we thought. The idea eventually is to have sort of a ring of these things around the world and solving a major part of the access issue in some of the most difficult terrain that the world presents us with. Titan, it's a new, you're going to hear a lot about aerial approaches, obviously. Titan, it's an aerial vehicle that we're developing. It's basically a UAV, but it's hovering in the stratosphere, and it, again, similar to the Loon balloons, which Loon is moving around and Titans are stationary. We're actually thinking about this and specifically to specifically target areas where we know the demand is especially high and the challenge is especially great, or if you think about disaster recovery efforts. Major natural disaster, the existing telco infrastructure goes down, you send up a couple Titans and you try and serve that urban population or other area using those things. We're investing in fiber. We do believe in fiber. We're talking, everyone knows that the demand is increasing. There's video. We also have the Internet of Things, which is quickly coming our way. Fiber is an essential part of this solution. So we pushed forward Project Link, which actually laid a fiber ring around Kampala, Uganda. And it's open to local ISPs and mobile operators. We're not competing with them. We're trying to provide the backbone infrastructure to let local companies serve their local users. And that's a key part of everything that we're talking about here. And then everyone, I think, on this panel agrees with that. This is about partnerships. This isn't about Google solving the issue. It's not about Telefonica being able to solve the issue. It's not about the ITU solving the issue. It's about all of us working together, really. It's the only way that it's going to happen. And I'm going to get into a little bit about smart policy making as well at the end, because that's a key part of it, right? But spectrum is a prime example of that. And as we heard from Chairman Wheeler, he's very focused on that, and he should be. We've got a project on spectrum, working obviously with the regulators there, that we help them figure out where the unused spectrum in South Africa currently is, and we worked with them to provide wireless service in the unused bands. The wireless service we're now offering using this project is traveling at distances of 6 kilometers and providing broadband speeds above 2 megabytes per second. And that wouldn't be possible if we weren't able to work hand in hand with the regulator. Obviously, Google can't go in and just grab spectrum, right? So it's about partnerships. We're also investing in some of the really big projects for providing undersea links. We've invested $300 million in partnerships with 5 other companies to build a trans-Pacific undersea cable system, and we're doing similar linkages based off of that cable down to Southeast Asia from Japan. Data centers, we built 14 data centers across the globe, and we're continuing to invest in internet exchange points, working with the ITU and partners all around the world. I think the story here again is really one of partnerships. No one can do it alone. It's important for us to work together to build on the good relationships that we have, to repair sometimes the relationships that have seen a little bit more friction, because this is really about moving to a world where the users are expecting us to solve the problem for us. And for those of us who are going to be part of the solution, there's not only the sense of doing the right thing, but there are tremendous business opportunities for those of us who are willing to partner up and work together to solve the problem. So I'm going to keep it at that because I think we're running a little bit over time, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, good morning to everyone, and I am delighted to be here this year again. And let me give thank you for the opportunity of sharing with you my views and the views of a telco operator committed with this problem of reality of connecting the unconnected, and welcome back to the real world of telco operators in the ground that has to face daily all the challenges of solving the problems of our customers in developing countries. So let me start with going back or reminding you, which has been very briefly, the changes of the telco sector in the last years, because I think that as a context is important to remember. So the telco sector has changed dramatically, you know, in the last years. It's no longer a standalone sector, and now is a part of the whole digital ecosystem. And the driver of this transformation has been the proliferation of services. This is something that is not new. We have been living with this in the last 10 years, let's say, but the difference, and that is changing dramatically the situation of this industry, is that these services that traditionally were competing in a separate way now are part of a single universe of competition and are competing face-to-face with each other. The telco sector has changed, but not just the telco sector. Internet has changed in the last year. So I think that this is something that is important to stress. Internet has changed dramatically in the last years from the north to the south. If we see the number of people accessing internet 10 years ago, and now the situation is radically different. Now more than 2/3 of people accessing to internet live in the south, and now is moving from the north of the south. Second, mobility, ubiquitous access is the second big transformation of the internet in the last years. And third, and this is very important, internet is changing from an open environment to an environment in which we are going to, we see that there is some closed ecosystems, closed platforms, and sometimes some restrictions for the way in which freely our customers can use the services over the internet. So that means that with this new reality, telco operators, we have to have a new agenda that for us is based on these 3 points, and the 4 points. Digital neutrality, we defend an open internet. We think that net neutrality is important, but we need to extend the discussion of why not to apply those principles to the rest of the value chain. Second, level playing field. We think that it's important to preserve this principle of same service and rule. We are not asking for more regulation for others, that we are asking for the same protection for our customers when they are using services competing face-to-face each other. Digital confidence, we think that is essential. This triangle of privacy, security, and data protection should be one of the base, and access and connected for a telco as Telefónica is a critical point on this agenda. The availability of the internet, because let me talk not about access to broadband, not about access to data, but about the thing that our customers want to receive, access to the internet. The availability among countries, the first thing that we need to realize is that the problem of connection, the unconnected, is totally different if we take a look of the developing countries or developed countries. So you see here the numbers, but there is one thing in common, is that the telco sector has done a huge investment in the last years, and this investment has been mainly made by the private sector, but has been a huge transformation essentially in developing countries. But the problems that we are facing in developed countries and developing countries are totally different. In developed countries, quality, reliability, speed, and essentially to provide our customers the new high-end services and technologies that they are demanding are the major challenge. But in developing countries, the big challenge is how to integrate these 2/3 of people that are not yet connected to the internet. Access, coverage and penetration and affordability as the only way of doing this are the major challenges. Let me give you an example that what has been done. And let me give the example of Brazil. Brazil now is a country under scrutiny. But believe me that Brazil is a marvelous country with a very, very bright future. And that we are totally confident on the future of Brazil. And let me show an example. What has happened in Brazil in the last year? So we have invested 27 billion, the telco operators. And this has had these two consequences. One, the number of mobile accesses. So I think that the number of Brazilians that are connected is huge. But for me, something that is more important. We have created a first-class infrastructure. And if you compare the telco infrastructure in Brazil, and by the way, in most of the Latin American countries, if you compare with the rest of the public infrastructure of the country, you see that there is a huge difference. You can see here in the World Economic Forum, all the infrastructures of Brazil, in comparative terms, are behind the number 10. Mobile infrastructure and fixed infrastructure are the number 37, 25. So there is a consequence of this, is that in Brazil and in Latin America, the infrastructure is a first-class one. And this can be an instrument of competitiveness of the country. And much more important, in a situation of crisis, this gives Brazil and Latin America big opportunities to create the new digital economy because the countries have the infrastructure for this. Let me go directly, which are the challenges of the telco operators in a context of trying to solve and to help to solve the problem of connecting the unconnected. Those are the three challenges: the regulation, the spectrum, the role of governments, and the innovation. The regulation is absolutely critical, as you know. So the role of regulation here is essential if we want to promote. I think that we have done in all these countries in which we operate, and in those countries where connecting the unconnected is a really, really critical problem, but we want to continue investing there. For them, the regulation friendly to investment is essential. And the promotion of investment should be the main focus of the regulation. That means that we need a predictable and stable regulatory environment, and this is essential, for instance, in Latin America today, in a situation of economic crisis, because if the sector wants to invest, need to have the predictability and stability of the regulation as a main point. Second, to ensure the level playing field in all the aspects. And third, and I will be back for this, a balance, an important but relevant balance between the public sector and the private sector, because the success that we have seen in the development of the telco and the telco infrastructure has been mainly driven by the private sector. Second, spectrum. I am going to go very quickly because I think that has been mentioned before, the critical role of spectrum in the connection of the unconnected. Essentially in those countries like Latin America in which the mobile infrastructure is the natural infrastructure for the access to the internet. So it's needed for the industry, to have to be aware of the strategy of the countries in the way they want to develop infrastructure, because we need it for our investment plans. And second, there is a factor which is essential and that should be understood by the governments. Every single dollar that you put on a spectrum is a dollar that you cannot use for investment. This is a balance that must be understood by the governments. So that we think is regulators should be focused on investment, so not in tax, and that probably this problem that we are facing in this sector is that sometimes the real minister for telecoms is the Minister of Finance, is something that we need to solve. So availability of spectrum is essential in this, especially in these countries in which spectrum and mobility is the main tool for the access to the internet. The role of government. The role of government is essential too. The role of government to understand the role of a spectrum and to understand which is the level of intervention of the governments. There are many models. I think that to have a broadband national plan is something general in all the countries. There are many models. We have 3 of these models in Latin America that we know very well: Peruvian, Chile, and Brazil, Argentina. All of them are good. The only condition for a model of development of broadband is the fair play. The fair play means that should be done in a non-discriminatory way. That means non-discriminating the private sector or the public sector in favor of the private sector in favor of the public sector, and neutral technology is absolutely fundamental. And there is one thing that should be well understood in this context, is that universal service is a common challenge for the whole sector. It's a common challenge for the governments, but it's a common challenge for all the companies providing services. And this, in a convergent scenario, I think that is really, really important. Innovation is the last factor that I think that we have to insist on, because innovation is essential and has been essential for the connection of the unconnected with the use of new technologies, 4G, 5G, satellite, with new products and services adapted to the needs of the customers, the new customers that must be integrated in the new internet services, and the use of commercial instruments. So I think that this has been one of the key elements that has permitted us to promote the connection of the unconnected. So to define tariffs specifically for people that we want to integrate into the internet and the connection, tariff bundles, and to think very well and how can be the right instrument for them to attract commercially to them. And because at the end of the day, and I am coming to my, is that if there is no possibility of expand the internet access, if there is no new services, a good and strong demand for these new customers. These new customers need new services adapted to their needs. So, and new commercial policies. Let me give you some examples. The financing of handsets has been essential. The prepayment, the co-payment on all the financial services. Some examples of how important is the demand in this field. And how in this aspect, I think that is essential to the role that governments can play. So I think that to every time that a government launch new services in e-government is helping us to extend the expansion. So finally, that is the 4 challenges that we have, but let me remind that are challenges that has to be managed in the general context of the situation of the industry. We have a big challenge with the connection of the unconnected, but we have in the telecom sector other challenges that are important, not just in the US or not just in Europe, in the whole world, and has to be managed too. Thank you so much.